The experts say you should never start with an apology, so I'm going to start with an apology. I apologize for the fact that I have to give this talk seated, because I don't think I can stand for a full hour. As many of you know, I have a few health challenges at the moment, but I didn't want to postpone again. I originally rescheduled because of the flu, but if I do it again, I may not be in any condition to give this talk at all, and I'm really anxious to go ahead. This morning, this afternoon, and on October 11th, I'm going to talk about 3 topics that are of critical importance. Why critical importance? Because what we do about them impacts the livelihood and even the survival of millions of people. This is my outline. This morning I'm going to talk about the science of climate change. This afternoon I'll talk about sustainable energy. And on October 11th, if I'm still above ground, we'll talk about sustainable transportation. A couple of definitions. What do we mean by climate? Climate is measured by assessing certain meteorological variables in a given region over long periods of time. The critical thing is long periods of time. Weather, on the other hand, is what you see when you look out the window at a particular point in time. Sustainability. The best definition is in the online dictionary, dictionary.com. Sustainability is the quality of not being harmful to the environment or depleting natural resources, and thereby, and this is critical, supporting long-term ecological balance. So let's get started on the science of climate change. How long have we known that the climate is changing? Have we known for hundreds of thousands of years, just since the Industrial Revolution, or more recently, since the beginning of the 20th century? Well, we weren't around hundreds of thousands of years ago, so we eliminate that. We were around during the Industrial Revolution, but we didn't know what the heck we were doing to the environment. So we've really only known what's been happening to the environment since the beginning of the 20th century. This is the story of how we came to realize that the climate was changing. Our story begins with this dude, Kublai Khan. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he was the first emperor of a unified China. As such, he had a big army at his disposal, which he put to work ensuring the security of the Silk Road, the main trading artery between China and Europe. The problem with the Silk Road was that it had become infested by bandits who would swoop out of the mountains, plunder the merchants' caravans, then swoop back into the mountains. Unfortunately, Kublai's army was not able to correct this problem. So the merchants went to Plan B, which was to ship their goods by sea. That worked fine if you were shipping to the Middle East or to Africa, but not so well if you wanted to get your goods to Europe. Enter Christopher Columbus, who persuaded a couple of venture capitalists in Spain to fund a voyage to the Indies, as Asia was then known. So in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue with his 3 ships, the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. Wait, no, that's not right. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. He sailed west, which was strange because everybody knew that the Indies were in the east. But Columbus was a smart cookie because he knew that the ancient Greeks had proved that the world was round and not flat. So he sailed west, but unfortunately he believed Ptolemy's mathematics, which was unfortunate because Ptolemy had greatly underestimated the circumference of the Earth. So when Columbus made landfall in the New World, he thought he had reached the Indies and naturally called the natives Indians, an error which has perpetuated to the present day. Unfortunately, what he did not find was the fine silks and the rare and costly spices of the East, so he had to turn around and come back empty-handed. To add insult to injury, he lost one of his ships on the way back, the Santa Maria, so all in all, his first voyage was a resounding failure. Next came the Portuguese navigator, Vasco da Gama, who was the first European to reach India by sea. He set sail from Lisbon, sailed south to get around Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope, and reached Calcutta in May of 1498. Next was Willem Schouten, sorry about the pronunciation, who preceded Horace Greeley and also went west. It was interesting that he wasn't searching for a trade route, he was looking for Terra Australis, the great Southland. He sailed south, rounded Cape Horn, but then ran into the roaring 40s, which are the strong trade winds blowing from west to east, which caused him to deviate far to the north. As a result, he missed the great Southland completely, but he did land in Asia, so he became the first person to pioneer a sea route to the west from Europe to Asia. This map demonstrates the difficulty that both of these explorers experienced. To get from Europe to Asia, both of which are in the northern hemisphere, they both had to deviate far to the south. Vasco da Gama way into the southern hemisphere around the Cape of Good Hope, and Willem Schouten way even further into the southern hemisphere to get round the New World. Unfortunately, the more direct route was plagued by a problem. To go from from Europe to Asia by the most direct route, you had to go through the Arctic Ocean. In other words, to get round the north side of the New World. But the Arctic Ocean was sucked in by solid ice, even in midsummer. There were 22 separate expeditions to try and navigate the Northwest Passage, starting with John Cabot in 1497 and ending with the unfortunate Franklin expedition in 1845. Unfortunate because the whole expedition disappeared and were never seen again. But then a strange thing happened at the beginning of the 20th century. Through traffic was established by the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen in the Gjøa, which was a converted herring boat with a shallow draft. But note that it took him 3 years to get through. His boat was locked in the ice for 2 successive winters, and it was only in the 3rd summer that he managed to get through. It wasn't until 10 years later that the first negotiation through the Northwest Passage was accomplished in a single season. And 40 years later, the ice had melted enough for a deep draft ship to get through. Ice continued to melt, and in 1984, for crying out loud, a cruise ship with tourists on it got through the Northwest Passage, and in 2016, a mega cruise ship with 1,000 tourists got through, the Crystal Serenity. And to prove it wasn't a fluke, they did it again the next year. And here's the Crystal Serenity on its way through the Northwest Passage. A total of 33 ships passed through the Northwest Passage last year, including 2 Russian mega-tankers carrying liquefied natural gas from Russia to Asia. So much for history. Now for some science and a teeny-weensy bit of, Donald, gasp, politics. Let's start with anthropogenic GHGs. Again, we need a couple of definitions. Anthropogenic comes from the Greek anthropos, meaning man or human, and geno, meaning cause, produce, or give birth to. In other words, caused by humans. GHGs are greenhouse gases, which are shown here. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. Methane is 86 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide is 300 times as powerful. Chlorodifluoromethane is 350 times as powerful. This is a fluorinated gas. And sulfur hexafluoride is almost 24,000 times as powerful. Fortunately, they're not all present in equal concentrations. Carbon dioxide from fossil fuels and industrial processes represent 65% of atmospheric greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide from forestry and other land use is 11%, for a total of 76%. Methane from agriculture, oil, and natural gas drilling, 16%. Nitrous oxide from bacterial action on fertilizers, 6%. And finally, fluorinated gases from refrigerants, air conditioning, and aerosol manufacture, 2%. From 1970, when anthropogenic greenhouse gases constituted 27 gigatons, that's billions of tons, of CO2 equivalent, to 2010, when they were almost twice as prevalent, we can see that anthropogenic greenhouse emissions have stepped up a long way in the intervening 40 years. And that has occurred since the Industrial Revolution, which began in 1760, and during which industrial processes belched huge amounts of polluting gases into the atmosphere. Before the Industrial Revolution, some 11 million metric tons of CO2 were emitted globally. In 2015, 3,000 times as much, 36.2 billion metric tons of CO2 were emitted globally. In order to confirm that what we were doing was unprecedented, we really had to look at ancient climates, the study of which is called paleoclimatology. Since we were not around in ancient times, we have to resort to indirect measurements of climate, which are called proxies. These data sets are measured here. I'm showing 18 different ways, but today we'll cover only 3: ice cores, ocean sediments, and tree rings. Ice cores are made by drilling ice in the Antarctic, particularly at the Vostok station, where the coldest temperatures on Earth have been recorded. If we do a longitudinal section through an ice core, we see a whole series of bands representing the record of precipitation each year. And these records now go back over 750,000 years. If we do a transverse section, we see millions of tiny air bubbles. And it's from these air bubbles that we can isolate carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide has been used to evaluate what changes have occurred over hundreds of thousands of years. This plot from the Vostok ice core data goes back over 400,000 years, and you can see that at no point during that time did carbon dioxide exceed 300 parts per million until 1950. The Industrial Revolution was right in here. Carbon dioxide levels have continued to increase until the current level of 407 parts per million, which is unprecedented. We can determine water temperatures from water, surprisingly, from the ice cores, based on a little bit of science. As you know, water consists of H2O, but both the H and the O come in 2 forms: light and heavy. There's light hydrogen, light oxygen, heavy oxygen. When water evaporates from the ocean in the tropical and temperate region, the warmer the water, the more water evaporates. It takes more energy to evaporate heavy water than light water. So in cold weather, the atmosphere contains less heavy water. When moist air is transported towards the poles and it cools down, heavy water is preferentially lost. So the colder it is, the more heavy water is preferentially lost. Hence, water in ice cores near the poles is depleted of heavy hydrogen and heavy oxygen. So by measuring these in the polar ice cores, we can estimate global temperatures in ancient times. We can do a similar trick using ocean sediment, and we've been doing this for over 50,000 years. Ocean sediments contain little critters called foraminifera, which have calcified shells that contain both calcium and magnesium. And the warmer it is, the more magnesium. The colder it is, the less magnesium. The third proxy that we've used is tree rings. Now, you'll remember that Bill Volker has talked to us about tree rings, so I'll direct all questions to Bill. The study of tree rings is called dendrochronology, and in brief, the thicker the tree ring, the warmer and the wetter the season that the tree ring was laid down. That's simplified, but Bill can explain it more. We now have 8,600 years of chronology in the bristlecone pine, and surprisingly, 12,500 years of chronology in the oak, because we can look at fossilized oak and oak used in ancient buildings. In 1998, there was a seminal paper in Nature by Mann, Bradley, and Hughes, which demonstrated the classical hockey stick graph of global temperature, later popularized by Al Gore. In this graph showing the last 1,000+ years of mean global temperature, most of which is generated from proxy data, the blue curve from Northern Hemisphere proxy data, the green curve representing 30-year global averages from proxy data, and the red curve, about which I'll say more later, from recent direct measurements of global temperature. Notice those curves corresponded very precisely. Let's look at recent climate data. This is a plot of annual mean global surface temperature since the late 19th century to the present time. It's displayed with the last 2 decades of the 19th century as a baseline. There is a caveat here, and that is, in El Nino years, warming of the Pacific does temporarily raise the average global temperature. So we have to eliminate years with El Ninos, which is done on this graph, and over the last 4 years, only 2016 was an El Nino year. So of the last 4 years, 3 out of the 4 were really fair dinkum, as we'd say in Australia, the warmest years ever recorded. Direct measurements from satellites have looked at carbon dioxide in parts per million and have confirmed current estimates from proxy data of 407 parts per million. Notice the continuous rise from the early 21st century, 2005, to the present time. When we superimpose the graphs for CO2 concentration from both proxy data and modern measurements on the warming estimates, again from proxy data and modern measurements, again we see very precise concurrence. The largest producers of CO2 emissions in the world in 2016, as we all know, have been China and the US, with other nations a long way behind. What happens when global temperature goes up? One thing that happens is that ice melts in the Arctic and Antarctic. Satellite measurements of the area of Arctic ice from around 1980 to the current time show a decrease from 8 million square kilometers to less than 5 million square kilometers, which represents a decrease of 13.2% per decade. This is I always forget the name of this. It's not stop motion, but it's a quasi-movie by taking a lot of photos and then playing them back quickly. Someone will tell me what that's called. A what? Time-lapse, thank you. These are photos taken from satellites, superimposed on the graph of CO2 measurement, and we'll follow CO2 measurement as the time-lapse photos demonstrate what happened to Arctic sea ice. And when we superimpose the median extent of the sea ice by the various measurements, we get this line for the period 1981 to 2010, and this shows where the ice was in September, summer of 2016, showing how much the ice has melted. It's not only the ice that melts, but the permafrost melts. Permafrost is mainly in northern Siberia and northern Canada. There are 1.4 trillion tons of carbon frozen in the permafrost. As the temperature rises and the permafrost thaws, microbes turn the carbon into methane. And you'll remember methane is 86 times as active a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So the warmer it gets, the more permafrost thaws, the more methane comes into the atmosphere. The warmer it gets, the more permafrost thaws. So we have a classical positive feedback loop. It's not only the Arctic that is affected, the Antarctic has shown similar changes. Satellite measurements of the massive ice in the Antarctic from the early 21st century to the present time show a loss of 2,000 gigatons. That's billion tons of ice over that period, representing 127 billion tons loss per year. Again, a movie of the satellite data following the carbon dioxide graph. Here, the melting ice is shown in color, with the more melting the ice, the darker the color. It's not only ice at the poles that melts. Glaciers worldwide are retreating. Satellite measurements of volume changes in glaciers worldwide have shown 8,000 cubic kilometers of volume loss since the mid-20th century to the present time. The glacier that I'm most familiar with is the Athabasca Glacier of the Columbia Icefield in Alberta. I've visited this glacier periodically for 50 years. Originally, the glacier came down to where this marker now stands. By originally, I mean when it was first seen, in 1908. When I first visited 50 years ago, the glacier came down to where the road is now. In 2016, the glacier has retreated to where this photograph shows it. It's been retreating 16 feet per year. It's retreated almost a mile in the last 125 years and has lost more than half of its volume in that time. This is the Muir Glacier in Alaska. Some of you may have seen it on Alaska cruises. Here it was in summer of 41. Here it is in summer of 2004. A huge difference. In 1760, Glacier Bay was completely iced in summer. Now the ice has retreated, and the Muir Glacier is now represented by this tiny bit of ice. It's a problem also for skiers. In the ski resort in the Italian Alps, the winter of 2017, just last winter, showed the least snow that they had measured in 150 years. What happens when the ice and snow melt? Well, it goes down to the sea eventually. These are measurements of sea level from tide gauges around the world, shown here, and more recently from satellite measurements, shown here. And relative to the late 19th century to the present time, there's been a sea level rise of almost 10 inches. Why is that important? Well, 8 of the world's 10 largest cities are near a coast. 40% of the US population lives in high population density coastal areas. As many as 650 million people are threatened by rising seas by the end of this century. 50 million in China, over 13 million in the US, and half the population of the Netherlands. People in islands in the ocean are particularly at risk. A sea level rise of up to 2 millimeters will cause over 2 million people to move from those islands. There's also a problem with fresh water. The total water on Earth hasn't changed in millions of years, but the ratio of fresh to salt water has changed. Cape Town in South Africa is running out of water to the extent that last year it was predicted that it would run dry completely on April 12th. Stringent restrictions were imposed, and that Armageddon date has been postponed till next year. In the meantime, the water reservoir continues to dry up. Here it was in February 2015. Here it is in May 2017. And the residents of Cape Town are reduced to queuing up at natural freshwater springs to get enough water for their households. There was a strict limit of 13 gallons per month. No, 13 gallons per day per person. And that allowed the date prediction for a total dryout to be postponed a little. The cities most likely to run out of drinking water are shown here, and these are big population cities. In fact, these 6 cities have populations of over 20 million. Total population at risk, over 200 million. Meanwhile, in the US,
water is constantly on the minds of people living in the western part of the U.S. because there just hasn't been much of it for several years.
This is clearly the worst drought in California history.
But the American West is not the only place thirsty for water.
More than half of the world's population lives in water-stressed areas, and according to the United Nations, that number will increase to 2/3 by 2025.
the U.S. Drought Monitor has published maps of drought-stricken areas in the U.S., and in this map it shows that exceptional drought, which is the most extreme form of drought, even extremer than extreme, shows that California and Texas have been the most affected, but lesser degrees of drought extend over large areas of the West and South. The International Panel on Climate Change was established by the United Nations and the World Meteorological Organization in 1988. It consists of thousands of scientists from around the world whose mandate is to assess the latest relevant data, particularly in peer-reviewed scientific and technical literature. They've published 5 assessments the most recent one of which in 2014 has concluded that warming of the climate system is not only unequivocal, but unprecedented over decades to millennia. Oceans and atmosphere have warmed, snow and ice have melted, sea level has risen. Recent climate changes have had widespread impacts on human and natural systems, and their confidence has increased from one assessment to the next, but particularly since the fourth report. And most important, they've come down on the side of clear and recent blame on anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, which are the highest in history. In fact, 97% of scientists agree that global warming is happening and that we are the cause. What about the other 3%? Well, a meta-analysis of publications in this field have shown that the higher consensus is among those with more expertise in climate science. And that's sort of pretty obvious. But this is demonstrated on this plot as expertise in climate science increases, so scientific consensus approaches 100%. Scientists who have no training in climate science have been publishing comments, and they are down in this region. So climate change is no longer a scientific issue, but it's certainly a political and economic one. Don, this is for you. 63% of Democrats consider global warming to be very or extremely important. Only 18% of Republicans do, according to the New York Times Stanford University poll. This is a busy graph plot, but I'll draw your attention to the highlighted portion. Only 18% of Republican baby boomers consider the Earth is warming because of human activity, compared with 75% of Democrats. Climate change has had a serious effect on public health around the world. In 2016, it's estimated there were 150,000 deaths occurring per year and 5 million human illnesses per year from these infectious diseases, bacterial, parasitic, and viral, and the effects of diarrhea, malnutrition, heat, drought, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, and other weather-related disasters. And it's predicted by 2030, 250,000 to 300,000 people will die per year as a result of global warming. It's not just people who are suffering. This is the mountain pine beetle, only 5 meters long. It used to be killed off in winter, but now that winters have become milder, it's killing off pine trees because it survives through the winter. All the gray is dead pine trees. The green is living ones. How has the world responded to the scientific consensus? In 2018, the Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, has stratified economic and other risks according to likelihood and impact. The greater the likelihood, the greater the impact, localizes risks to this top right quadrant. And with the exception of cyber attacks, every one of these risks is related to climate change. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has occurred 3 times, of which you all know most about the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement decided that nations on Earth would keep global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and hopefully below a rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius. They determined to strengthen the ability of countries of the world to deal with the effects of climate change, particularly developing countries and the most vulnerable countries, and to be transparent about their activities.
The world had made a deal. In December, the world leaders came to an agreement to stop climate change.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
World leaders congratulated each other because lengthy negotiations had finally resulted in the decision to prevent a catastrophic warming of the Earth.
As of October 2017, only 3 countries were not parties to the Paris Agreement: United States, Nicaragua, and Syria. United States was originally a signatory, but our dear leader withdrew. By November of 2017, both Nicaragua and Syria had signed on, leaving the United States as the only country in the world that was not party to the Paris Agreement. So what has been the United States' response to the scientific consensus? I won't read all of these. These are non-political statements from National Geographic, which is an environmental organization, not a political organization. I'll give you a minute or so to scan through those. It hurts too much for me to read them out. But wait, there's more. And more. These are recent publications, so it is continuing. And I haven't pulled references from all of these, but you can see that rolling back regulations is widespread. I'll leave you with this cartoon. What if it's all a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? This afternoon, sustainable energy. Thank you. That's enough. I apologize for the rather halting delivery and for the speed. I had to speed up to leave time for questions. Oh, Don, go ahead.
I just wanted to say I appreciate you putting in a couple slides for me. I had a decision to make this morning, whether to be here or to be over at a hearing across the street in the Capitol, where the Legislative Committee on Carbon Reduction is having a regular hearing. And it so turns out that one of the major documents that Trump administration cited in getting out of the Paris Agreement is testifying across the street in the Capitol. I really wanted to be there and boo and hiss, but I'm sorry that I'm not sorry that I came and saw this marvelous presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Incidentally, if there are questions that are too involved to answer in the time available, email me your questions and I will email answers to everybody.
Hi, Cassia. I think one of the other effects of climate warming is, in addition to the effects on the ocean, is the loss of those little tiny, they're not like diatoms, but the other little things that everything grows upon in the ocean because of acidification. I think there's been studies on that. Do you have any information, more information on that?
No, I don't.
What I mean,
I have not consulted the whales who live on that stuff, but it doesn't surprise me. I'll see what I can find out.
I read that the process of fracking and pumping water down back into the earth is exerting pressure and causing minor earthquakes. Is it possible that this redistribution of the melting ice on the surface of the planet could do the same?
Wow, that's a tough question. Remember that the Arctic ice is floating, so it does not exert any pressure on the land. The Antarctic ice is largely land-based, and scientists have estimated that melting of Antarctic ice has caused the Antarctic land to rise. Now, whether that's directly related to frequency of earthquakes, I'm not sure, but that has been a definite finding.
Jeanette, thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. You've given us an overdose of bad news this morning, both about climate and your references to your health. But I was wondering, as you clearly have been thinking about this for quite a while, have you come up with suggestions about ways out of it?
I planted that question. No, I didn't, but thank you for asking it. I've been thinking about this for 4 years, since I bought my first electric car. It's tempting to say that there is very little one person can do. You can magnify your influence by emailing or telephoning your representatives and senators. You can post opinion on the widespread media. What do you call those media now? The who? Social media thing. I'm sorry, my ability to remember names is sadly lacking. It'll come back eventually, they tell me. But another thing you can do as an individual is to try and decrease your carbon footprint. My granddaughter refuses to fly. I refuse to fly, not just because of the carbon footprint, but because it's a very unpleasant experience. You can minimize your use of electricity. Don't leave lights on when you don't have to. Turn down your thermostat. Buy an electric car. Until recently, electric cars have been too expensive, but they're getting cheaper and much more accessible. And by 2025, they will be as cheap as, if not cheaper than, internal combustion vehicles. There are currently electric cars like the Chevy Bolt, which are very accessible. The Tesla Model 3 is still a bit spendy, but we'll get to $35,000 next year. If you cannot make it as far as an electric car, try a hybrid for your next car purchase. I'm sure you can all come up with other thoughts, but the aim of the exercise is to try and minimize the formation of CO2 and minimize the level of CO2 and other polluting gases in the atmosphere.
One more thing, we can vote.
Oh, yes. Actually, I have been on record in the social media of saying just that. Vote. I don't care whom you vote for, but vote.
Peter, I had a question. I've read that there's a natural cycle, I think, of warming and freezing. We all know about the Ice Age, et cetera. I think I read that this is accelerating the next ice age. How does that work?
There is a natural cycle called the solar cycle. The Earth warms to some extent according to this cycle, but as you've seen over actually 750,000 years, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has never exceeded 300 parts per million. And the global temperature over similar periods has never gone above the level that we were measuring before the Industrial Revolution. So the effect of the solar cycle is small. The solar cycle results from variation in the Earth's orbit around the sun. Those variations are pretty small, and so the variations in climate resulting from the solar cycle are far outweighed by anthropogenic causes.
In the absence of questions, I have one more question. And I read somewhere, or I remember, that when we reached 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide, I guess, that there was no turning back. There was no way of recovering from that. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, we have already reached more than 400 parts per million. We're at 407, I believe, now. And several scientists have gone on record saying just that there is no turning back. What we are left with is making it less worse than it would be if we did nothing.
Peter, I have a question about electric cars. I think they're a wonderful idea. My concern is, what happens to the batteries?
I will answer that in more detail on October 11th. But studies have shown that Tesla batteries, I'm picking Tesla because they have the best thermal control of the batteries, show up to 6 to 7% degradation over 250,000 miles, which is longer than most people will drive. When those batteries get down to about 80%, which is probably around the 400,000 mile range or limit, they can still be used for home batteries, which I'll talk about this afternoon. When they're too old even for that, which is about forever, the materials in the batteries can be recycled. So I'm never going to have to get new batteries for my Tesla. If you bought an early Nissan Leaf, you probably will have to, because they do not have good thermal control. The Chevy Bolt is about halfway between. So, but I don't think that should be the determining factor. I think for as long as you own your car, if you buy any make of car that's electric and that has some thermal control of the batteries, you're in good shape.
Thank you, Peter. I think we've run out of time, and we're really looking forward to this afternoon's presentation.
Thank you for coming back. We're going to talk about sustainable energy along the lines of this outline. We're going to talk about renewable sources, particularly solar and wind, and contrast those with non-renewable sources, particularly coal and natural gas. So here are our protagonists, solar and wind versus coal and natural gas. I won't say very much about hydro or nuclear, since these are not changing at the same rate as the others. Here is a plot of the annual share of total US electricity generated by source of the energy. Coal in, coal and natural gas were pretty much tied by 2015 as sources of electricity generation. Nuclear substantially behind, hydro even further behind, and renewables just starting to make its run. Non-hydro renewables plus hydro totaled 14%, a figure that we'll refer to later. So remember that 14%. That was at the end of 2015. In 2016, some remarkable things happened. If we look at the addition to generating capacity, in 2016, renewables constituted 62% of added capacity. Non-renewables, only 38%. Even more interesting was the retired generating capacity in 2016. Non-renewables accounted for almost all of the capacity that was retired, particularly coal, but surprisingly, even to some extent, natural gas. Wind and solar constitute only 1.6%, well, renewables as a whole, only 1.6%, with wind and solar between them less than 1%. So let's start by talking about coal. Between 2000 and 2010, coal was king. But you'll notice here that in 2010, coal fell off a cliff. There's a sharp drop in electricity generation by coal to 2016. What happened in 2016? Trump was elected. As a result, coal staged a mini renaissance, and the prediction, anything newer than 2016 is a projection from the US Energy Information Administration. They predicted that in 2020, the Trump administration would be out, so coal would resume its downward trend. The renaissance in coal was the result of the fact that Trump was trying to bring coal jobs back. And one of the ways he did this was by delaying Obama-era mine safety rules. And this was the result. If you look at alternate bars here, which refer to what happened in the coal industry, these other bars were other mining accidents. But the plots here demonstrate total fatalities for coal in 2013, when 20 miners died. 2014, 16 died. 2015, 12 died. 2016, 8 died. So there was more than 50% drop over this period until 2016. The safety rules for coal mines were relaxed. What happened? Almost double the number of fatalities in 2017. It was predicted by the US Energy Information Administration that it would be almost 2030 before renewables would overtake coal. I differ with that for reasons that you will see in a moment. I maintain that this steep rise in renewables will continue so that the crossover with coal occurs substantially before 2030. That has already occurred in Europe. Last year, electricity generated from renewables surpassed coal power. So Europe is way ahead of us. Allianz is the biggest insurer in Europe, and they have committed to stop insuring coal plants and coal mines by 2040. In the US, both the West Coast and the East Coast have very little coal generation, as you can see by this code here. Both have less than 25% electricity produced from coal last year. Most of the coal generation occurs in the central US, and particularly in Wyoming, Missouri, Kentucky, and West Virginia. However, only one jurisdiction in North America has fully eliminated coal as a source of electricity generation, and that's Ontario. Not only has it done that, but it did it 4 years ago. They're way ahead of the game. Meanwhile, jobs in the coal mining industry have been falling precipitously by 90% from 1920 to 2016. This is a topic you don't see talked about very often. Coal ash is more radioactive than nuclear waste. This appeared in Scientific American. It requires a bit of an explanation because it is a bit misleading. There is radioactive material in coal and fly ash. Fly ash is what's left after you burn coal. There's uranium, thorium, radium, radon, and a radioactive isotope of lead. Those radioactive materials constitute 1 to 3% of all environmental radiation. The fly ash emitted by a power plant carries into the surrounding environment, that's the key, 100 times more radiation than a nuclear power plant producing the same amount of energy. How come? Because fly ash is freely distributed in the environment without any regulation, but there are strict regulations governing how much nuclear waste can be released. There are strict regulations about shielding, either by water or dry cask. Not only is coal a source of radiation in the environment, but radium has been found in every oil-producing region in the country, from Alaska to Florida. The oil-water mixture pumped to the surface contains radiation levels 5 to 30 times higher than the government allows to be released from nuclear plants. Yet radiation release in the oil industry is wholly uncontrolled. So much for coal. Let's say a few words about natural gas. The blue curve is the natural gas curve, And after 2016, it took a bit of a dip, which I think is due to two factors: the mini renaissance in coal utilization and a steep rise in renewables. There are some problems with natural gas. Although it's been hailed as the transition fuel on the way to renewable energy, and although combustion of natural gas releases only half the CO2 of coal, the bulk of natural gas is methane. And as we saw earlier, methane is 86 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. But the problem is that methane leaks at every stage of production, transportation, and use. In fact, leaking methane constitutes 132 to 165 million tons of methane per year, which is not insignificant. I'd like you to pay close attention to this dynamic representation. It describes oil and gas pipeline incidents, where an incident is a leakage, a fire, an explosion, or any other misadventure that causes fatalities, injuries, or property damage. Most of the problems that have occurred in the center of the country, where most of the pipelines are concentrated. But notice that between 1986 and 2016, there were over 9,000 such incidents, causing 548 fatalities, 2,576 injuries, and get this, $8.5 trillion in property damage. The latest disaster was in the Boston area that you probably read about a couple of weeks ago. There were 70 natural gas explosions resulting from the fact that overpressurized natural gas lines leaked a lot of natural gas, which then exploded. But despite all this, the Trump administration wants to make it easier to release methane into the air. Unbelievable. Okay, let's look now at renewable energy. This curve, which I think is green. Sorry, I'm colorblind, but it looks green to me. Am I right? Yes. Yay. Now, we all saw that the projection was that after 2016, there'd be a steep rise in renewable energy. But for reasons that I don't quite understand, the U.S. Energy Information Administration decided that that rise would flatten out and that it would be almost 2030 before renewable energy would be used greater than coal. This is my prediction for a continued steep rise in renewable energy. And the reason for my prediction you'll see momentarily. But first, let's look at the different types of solar power.
The ink on the climate agreement had hardly dried when in January, the yearly World Future Energy Summit took place. In Abu Dhabi, world leaders, investors and businessmen assembled to talk about energy.
Your Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, ladies and gentlemen.
But they didn't just talk about the climate agreement. The main topic was what had happened to the price of sustainable energy.
We have made a good start.
A good start.
There has been remarkable progress on many fronts. The fall in prices for renewable energy, especially solar energy, and the emergence of new business models, are bringing sustainable energy within which
as a result of progressive advances in technology, policy, and finance, those solutions are reliable, efficient, and commercially competitive. We are seeing sustainable and clean technologies ramping up across all geographies, all industries, and in the most unusual places.
Last year, while all eyes were on the Paris climate negotiations, just outside Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, history was being made. This solar energy plant has changed the world. Last year, a contract was signed to expand this solar plant. The new part of the plant will produce electricity more cheaply than gas plants. Sustainable energy experts all over the world were taken by surprise by the deal. Michael Liebreich is one of them, who since 2004 has been running Bloomberg New Energy Finance, a leading research agency for investors in sustainable energy.
The Diwa solar project was really a wake-up call, particularly in the Middle East region, but really around the world, because it was an unsubsidized project, unsubsidized price, and it came in at 5.84 US cents per kilowatt hour. It opened the floodgates to a lot of countries saying, well, we would quite like a piece of that. Imagine, this is in the Gulf, you're generating solar power more cheaply than you could generate from gas. It changes everything.
It's not just in the Gulf.
The low price for electricity from solar energy has made the electricity company hungry for more. After a 200 megawatt expansion, there is to be a new expansion next year of 800 megawatt. And along with this deal, the Emirates have tripled their target for sustainable energy by 2020.
My understanding is that what they've told those organizations, those companies bidding, is that they would expect it to be sub 5 cents, under 5 US cents per kilowatt hour. It changes everything if solar is the cheapest single form of new power in a country or in a region.
Dubai is not the only place where solar energy is cheaper than fossil fuel electricity. All over the world, there are projects getting set to produce sustainable energy more cheaply than coal or gas plants. Australia, Chile, the state of California, Italy and Jordan have all reached the tipping point for the production of sustainable energy. And it doesn't stop there. In India, plans for a coal plant in Punjab were cancelled at the last minute because it was cheaper to cover the terrain with solar panels. It is expected that over the next few years, Mexico, Germany, Morocco, China, and a number of American states can be added to the list of countries where sustainable energy will be cheaper. Deutsche Bank expects that in a few years, solar energy will be cheaper in 80% of the world. Mike Eckhart of Citibank, who's been active in the field of sustainable energy for 40 years, is not surprised.
All of this is very predictable if you know manufacturing economics, and all of my team in those days were engineers with MBAs, so they knew how to run these estimates. All this has been very predictable, actually. And the 70s was the beginning of all this, and I picked it up right at the beginning. But it's been driven really by the cost effectiveness of renewable energy, particularly renewable electricity, is what we're talking about. Just in these last 3 to 5 years, particularly 5 years, the cost of solar cells has dropped tremendously. Today, even though there are many incentives, many subsidies, many encouragements to use renewable energy, it's actually become cost competitive on its own, even without those. So it's good to have those, but this is a very big success happening right now.
Let's say a few more words about costs. These plots show unsubsidized, and that's important, levelized cost of energy. Levelized meaning the dollars of the energy per megawatt hour for both wind and solar. From 2009 to 2016, the cost of wind energy has fallen 66%. The cost of solar energy has fallen 85%. Now that refers to utility scale, not quite as much as domestic rooftop solar. But utility scale solar is falling even faster than wind energy costs. The most remarkable thing is the latest bid in Colorado, which includes storage, by Xcel Energy, which bid 2.1 cents per kilowatt hour for wind and 3.6 cents per kilowatt hour for solar. As the cost of solar panels has plummeted, the deployment of solar panels worldwide has zoomed. I've added the figures for 2017 here. It's gone from 65 gigawatts in 2015 to 98 gigawatts in 2017. You've heard the word subsidies mentioned a couple of times. There's a lot of misinformation about subsidies, so let's see what the truth is. There's nothing wrong with capitalism that a government subsidy can't fix. This is the view from the right. The right considers that Washington is dealing out bags of money for renewable energy. The view from the left is that the oil and gas industries have grown fat on subsidies from Washington. This is a clipping from Oil Change International, which is an oil industry publication, and I think that's significant. Rex Tillerson, who was the CEO of ExxonMobil, while under oath, denied the existence of fossil fuel subsidies. Oil Change International said, "This is dangerously incorrect." In fact, the oil and gas industry receives more than $17 billion in subsidies per year. And ExxonMobil got at least $1 billion of that. If you take into account costs that result from air pollution and extreme weather, the American fossil fuel industry has received $240 billion a year over the last decade in implied subsidy. In fact, worldwide, if climate and environmental costs are included, world fossil fuel subsidies totaled, and get this, $5.3 trillion in 2015 alone. That constituted 6.5% of the entire global GDP, which is more than global spending on healthcare. That is a sobering statistic. And then Big Oil has the cheek to ask for government money to safeguard their refineries on the Gulf. They've asked for $12 million, nearly all of which is coming from public funds. The mind boggles. Okay, let's look at different solar installations. This is what's called a utility-scale photovoltaic solar farm. By utility scale, we mean it's a solar farm established by a utility company to serve all its customers. This is one in Hawaii. It's a solar city installation. Pretty big, but not as big as the world's largest solar farm in India, which has 25 million solar panels. That's a bunch of solar panels. That has a capacity of just under 650 megawatts and a capacity well under $1 billion. But it's not going to be the biggest one for long. Saudi Arabia is planning a 200 gigawatt project costing $200 billion from between now and 2030 throughout the country. They are certainly hedging their bets. One step down from utility scale is microgrid scale. This is a microgrid PV solar farm in the Philippines established by an individual community for their own residents. And they've added here battery storage by Tesla. A further step down is industrial scale PV solar installations. And this is the Hewlett-Packard facility in Palo Alto. You can see a lot of rooftop solar panels. Industrial scale also applies to individual buildings, not domestic. Howard Elementary School in Eugene has rooftop solar classified as industrial scale, as does St. Francis Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. This is the industrial scale solar PV facility donated by Tesla to the Children's Hospital in Puerto Rico to get them up and running after the power outage that resulted from Hurricane Maria. The next step down is domestic rooftop. This is a typical domestic rooftop solar array. But the next development in rooftop solar has been announced by Tesla, and they are already making solar tiles which include solar PV generation. So each tile is a solar PV panel. And in fact, the result can be quite beautiful. Not every roof is suitable for solar arrays. Our roof was not, so we put our solar installation in the backyard. Fortunately, we had enough space. And this is the plot of our electricity generation throughout 2017. It was enough to cover all our electricity costs through about halfway through December, when we had to pay the grid for a little bit more electricity. And that was because we had an electronic glitch in July. You can notice instead of being a normal distribution curve, it fell in July. But that was fixed by Solar City, and soon we came back to normal. Had we been normal all the way through, we would have provided all our electricity for the whole year. These are all the solar installations around Salem. I bet you didn't realize there were that many. There's a different type of solar energy, and that is thermal solar. Excuse me. You may have seen these on homes with swimming pools. These are plastic water pipes embedded in black material so that the heat from the sun warms the water pumped through the pipes, and that circulates through the pool and keeps the pool warm. Now, that's a domestic example. This is a utility scale example, and it's called a concentrating solar power or thermal solar farm. In the center here is a tower containing molten salt, and around it are large numbers of what are called heliostats that are mirrors that move as the sun moves and continue to focus the sun's rays on the molten solar. This one is in Crescent Dunes, Nevada. It has over 10,000 heliostats, which keep molten salt at 1,000 degrees. And you'll notice the term energy storage because this also acts as a storage facility because the molten salt stores the energy by virtue of the fact that it stores its heat. The heat is used to generate steam, which drives turbines, which generate power. Globally, Solar PV installations have gone from virtually zero to over 400 gigawatts. Notice this is a logarithmic scale by 2017. In this particular interval, there was an order of magnitude increase, a little less in the other years. Installed solar capacity in the USA in 2016 was 40,000 megawatts. That's 40 gigawatts. But notice China has installed almost twice that much. Worldwide, the added capacity from solar in 2017 was 98 gigawatts, which compares with only 73 gigawatts of added fossil fuel capacity. It's interesting to look at what happens to jobs in renewable industries because of Trump's emphasis on jobs in the coal industry. In 2015, there were over 200,000 solar-powered jobs. By 2020, that's predicted to more than double to 420,000, while coal mining jobs drop 90%. So much for solar. Let's talk now about wind.
So what does this I hear about a governor in South Dakota who's all pro-wind?
Yes.
Is he like a Democrat?
No, he is a Republican. So we're talking about Governor Dennis DeGarde from South Dakota. He's a Republican, and he said this.
Wind power has contributed more than $2 billion in capital investment to our state for the construction and maintenance of the 14 wind projects now in operation. These projects, along with the South Dakota businesses that supply goods and services to the wind industry, support nearly 2,000 good-paying jobs in our state. Today, I am proud to say that South Dakota is one of only 2 states where wind power provides over 30% of in-state power generation. That's power that the whole region can count on. In fact, the regional operator of our energy system has noted that they can reliably meet over 50% of the current demand for our 13-state region with wind power alone, and that's not even the limit. Wind farms now pay approximately $5 million each year in lease payments, creating a new drought-resistant revenue stream that can help family farmers and ranchers expand their operations or withstand market fluctuations in crop prices. As wind power has grown to be nearly a third of our energy production, our grid is as reliable as ever. With this experience in mind, I will continue to support the expansion of renewable energy in South Dakota. I hope you will too.
This is the distribution of wind power plants in the US. You'll notice concentrated mainly in the central US. In Oregon and Washington, wind turbines are concentrated along the Columbia Gorge. If you look at the installed capacity in the US, Texas is way ahead with 20 gigawatts of installed capacity. Oregon and Washington are well down the list, but if you add them together, because the wind turbines are really along the border in the Columbia Gorge, they total over 6,000 megawatts, which places us more than California in the number 4 position. As far as total energy delivered is concerned, Texas is way ahead of the game with almost 60 terawatt hours of energy delivered by wind. The cumulative capacity of wind energy in the US reached, by the end of 2016, 80,000 megawatts, 82,000, or 82 gigawatts. And this is a remarkable statistic. Somewhere in the US, a new wind turbine rises every 2.4 hours. By the end of the third quarter of 2017, the US has reached a total of 52,000 wind turbines. Again, here we have the 82 gigawatts in the USA, but again, we're outclassed by China, which has installed more than twice that much wind power capacity. Offshore wind farms are not popular in the US, but are in Europe. And these are the largest 10 offshore wind farms in Europe. And you'll notice that 7 of the 10 are in the United Kingdom, 2 in Germany, and 1 in the Netherlands. The cumulative global wind power capacity has gone from almost nothing in 2001 to 539 gigawatts, which is a 22,000 plus fold increase over a relatively short period. Let's look at advantages and disadvantages of wind turbines. The energy they produce is low cost. They create jobs at a tremendous rate. In fact, they're the source of fastest job growth in the US. The fuel is clean. It's a domestic energy source. We don't have to import oil. It has the largest renewable generating capacity of all renewable sources. And as mentioned by Governor Delgado, it provides an income to landowners. What are the disadvantages? Well, obviously, it requires a windy location. And obviously, the wind doesn't blow all the time. As you'll notice, if you drive around wind farms, they occupy a lot of area, and they cost a lot to install up front. They can be damaged by extreme weather. They have a visual and oral impact that some people object to. And there's the question of bird deaths. An environmental group has estimated that wind turbines kill 234,000 birds a year in the US alone. The Smithsonian, meanwhile, estimated that cats killed 2.4 billion birds a year in the US. Do the math. There are a couple of alternative wind power generators, the egg beater design and the bladeless vortex design, neither of which have achieved enough efficiency to compete with wind turbines. Wind power jobs, like solar jobs, are zooming. In 2015, there were 77,000 wind power jobs in the US. By 2020, it's predicted there'll be almost 500,000. Again, well, going from wind power to total renewable energy jobs, again, we're outclassed by China and even by Europe. In 2016, there were a total of 777,000 jobs in the renewable industry, compared with 1.1 million in Europe and 3.6 million in China, 9.8 million throughout the entire world. That's a lot of jobs. China has committed to plowing $361 billion into renewable fuel by 2020. They are really committed. But they're a long way behind certain countries, like Iceland, which already generates 100% of its energy from renewables because of its hydro and geothermal resources. All of these, down to Austria, exceed 80%, with a couple of surprise members, Kenya and Belize. Also Costa Rica is almost at 100%. I was surprised to see those countries in the almost 100% club. Remember I told you to remember 14% from the US? There we are, a pathetic 14%, way below all these other countries. We need to say a few words about energy storage, because obviously the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. The world's largest battery installation associated with a renewable energy generator is in South Australia, my old stamping ground, at the Hornsdale Wind Farm. Adjacent to the Hornsdale Wind Farm is a large, in fact the world's largest battery installation installed by Elon Musk on a bet. He bet that he could do it within 100 days of contract signing or it would be free. And free is significant since it costs $50 million. However, note that it will pay for itself in 1 year. This is a little bit technical, but concentrate on this sentence. The batteries stabilize the power grid by charging up when there's too much power on the grid and then releasing that power to the grid when the grid has too much load for it to handle. In the 2 hottest days in January, the battery owner made $1 million in fees from the grid by allowing itself to take excess energy and then providing that excess energy back when the grid needed it. Now, they were the hottest days in January of this year, but it gives you an idea of how much money a battery installation can actually make. That's not the only advantage. That battery delivered 100 megawatts into the national grid in 140 milliseconds. The Energy Minister in South Australia said that if we had to turn on emergency generators, it would take us 10 to 15 minutes. And if we had to turn on the Torrens Island power station, it would take a half to an hour, whereas the batteries can do it in milliseconds. In fact, Tesla's giant battery in South Australia reduced service costs by 90%. That's a utility-scale storage system. They're a storage system for domestic users too. Tesla sells what they call a Powerwall, which are batteries that for $5,500 will allow you to store enough electricity for 7+ days when you have a power outage. There's a German company called Sonnenbatterie, which is a bit more expensive, for 16 kilowatt hours, $22,800. And finally, I want to say a few words about advances in batteries, which will seg into my talk on October 11th. John Goodenough, a delightfully named scientist, is the inventor of the lithium-ion battery. And he has gone on record to say that he has invented a new battery with a lot of advantages. Number one, it's lower cost because it substitutes low-cost sodium for lithium. Secondly, it's non-combustible because of the solid-state glass electrolyte. You've heard of lithium-ion batteries catching fire. Well, there are ways of doing that, but Goodenough's new battery is supposed to prevent that completely. It has a very long battery life, a greater number of charge and discharge cycles, a high energy density, 3 times the energy density of today's lithium batteries. So the batteries are smaller and lighter, particularly helpful in cars. And also helpful in cars is fast charging in minutes rather than hours. And a major advantage is that the Goodenough battery performs well in sub-zero temperatures, again because of the solid-state electrolyte. That's one of the weaknesses of lithium-ion batteries. You lose range when the temperature is very cold. So I'll stop there. We'll take up the story of the use of batteries in transportation on October 11th. And we have 10 minutes for questions.
Oh, Peter, wonderful. Thank you, thank you. Chink's back here in the back row. We were in California visiting relatives, went past a local high school, and in the intervening year, they had put up some wonderful covers all over the student parking lot. And my husband and I said, well, that's a nice way to treat these young people. You know, what do you... Well, my brother-in-law said, oh, no, they're all solar panels. The school district is making enough money or making enough power to power the school for the year and sell it back. Wow, there's an idea.
I didn't show this slide because it was sort of personal, but my granddaughter did a study of a microgrid for Middlebury College. And that was well enough received that she was invited to an energy conference in Minnesota, and she attracted the attention of the Sierra Club and was sent by the Sierra Club to the Paris Climate Conference, where she honchoed, I guess that should be honchoed, the youth section of that conference, and was the anchor person for the TV that was transmitted from the youth section of the conference around the world. She interviewed the president of the Sierra Club, and she did as good a job as any major TV anchor person, in my opinion. But I'm a little biased. So there are individual communities, colleges, schools, and as we saw, hospitals, who are developing their own microgrids or industrial scale solar plants, because it saves a lot of money once you can finance the upfront cost. A little plug here. I am an investor in a company that helps institutions finance solar installations when they're not big enough for banks to take notice, when they're not multi-million-dollar installations. When they're up to $1 million, a few thousand to $1 million, this company called Wonder Capital does the financing, and they are growing in leaps and bounds. I'm not a financial advisor, but if anybody is interested in more information, contact me and I'll put them onto the website. So there's a lot, individuals, institutions, small institutions, larger institutions can do other than the large utilities.
This is David. Since there are 4 time zones across the United States, we actually, if we could distribute this stuff, we would not need any new energy for a long time, because each time zone has its peak. And if we could spread that out, there would be no need for new energy at all.
Now that's a very interesting concept I have never seen mentioned. I'll put that out there with appropriate acknowledgement. Thanks.
Peter, this is Bill. One of the strategies in the past that has been used for sustainable construction was sequestering fly ash in concrete. And I wondered if, in your research, if you ran into anything about radiation problems from that.
Not so much radiation problems, but carbon dioxide problems. Concrete is one of the biggest generators of CO2 of any industry, other than transportation and electric production. It's amazing how much CO2 is produced in the production of concrete. I can't give you a figure, but it's easy to find by Googling. I haven't heard of any radiation effects from that. There is a certain amount of shielding if the fly ash is within the concrete. That may be why it hasn't attracted much attention. But it certainly attracted attention as far as CO2 is concerned.
Hi there. This is Cassia. I'm back in the back. You've used megawatt and gigawatt several different times, and my question concerns, I don't actually know what a megawatt and a gigawatt actually are. I mean, how many people does a megawatt serve? How many people does a gigawatt serve? I assume it's 1,000 times more than a megawatt, but it would help to put that in context. And one of your early slides, you also talked about additional capacity and didn't define what additional capacity meant. Is it additional capacity from where we started in 2001 or 10 or what?
Okay.
Sorry.
When you buy power from the grid, from PGE, you buy it in kilowatt hours. And it's about, at the moment in Oregon, 8.1 cents per kilowatt hour, averaged over Oregon. So you can look at your annual kilowatt hour consumption from your own house to figure out how many kilowatt hours it takes to run your particular house. Of course, everybody's house is going to be different. A megawatt hour is 1,000 kilowatt hours, and a gigawatt hour is 1,000 megawatt hours. So as you step up each order of magnitude, you step up a huge number of domestic and industrial consumers. I don't remember exact figures, but a lot of these microgrids generate enough power for several thousand homes. The utility scale grids generate enough power for hundreds of thousands of homes. So that gives you some idea. The difference between capacity and energy is important, and it takes a bit of wrapping your head around. Capacity is another word for power. And it's like saying this installation has a power of X megawatts, which means that in 1 hour it can deliver X megawatt hours of electricity. Energy is power times time. So you'll notice that when I showed the graph of Texas generating multiple terawatts of megawatt hours, that's delivered energy over the lifetime of its wind generators. So it's the difference between power and energy.
Hi, Peter. How about what information do we have about life cycle of panels and turbines? We know that things wear out and or are improved. Is there any studies been going how many times we may have to replace them in a 10-year period or whatever period?
I know that the warranty of the Tesla roof solar panels is 50 years. You probably won't be living in your house after 50. You won't. I won't in 50 years' time. Our solar panels have a warranty of, I can't remember if it's 25 or 30 years, but it's up there. Wind turbines are subject to extreme weather. And you'll notice that when the wind's strong, the turbines shut down. That hasn't prevented damage to some wind turbines. I don't know what the monetary cost of that damage is, but I suspect it's a pretty small fraction of the monetary benefit of the power produced.
I think that means we've come to the end of our hour, and thank you for lifting our spirits with this session.